Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to talk about where to fly. We'll be focusing on drones and radio control model aircraft. What we'll do is update you on what the FAA does with airspace, the involvement of local communities and governments on the land space, how those two intersect and are affecting our flying. And we're going to take some lessons learned from what happened to the ultralight community over the past 40 years as they enter the same situation we have with the FAA and property owners and their flights. Let's get to it. Again, thank you for watching this video. Thank you also for any likes and subscribes. They really help the channel. Also, this model in the background, it's a conversion of a Guilos Aranca C3 to radio control flight. I'll put a card up there for if you want to take a look at that build video. So the question is coming up more and more, where can we fly our drones and RC model aircraft? It's becoming more urgent because the population is increasing. More people are out there. And because of the nature of our models, especially the smaller RC models, the drones for sure, we're flying in places where people previously are not used to seeing model aircraft fly. So there's more and more interaction with the public, and the public does have a voice on what type of flight activities take place near their private property, where they might be living and working and so forth. So it's worthwhile to kind of take a moment to see how we got to this point and where we're going to go in the future and what we can do to mitigate any negative impact for our radio control model airplane flying. So because this involves flying, the FAA is involved. Congress has an interest in this because drones, not only do we fly them and enjoy them recreationally, they're becoming a huge growth industry for the future of the country and other nations in the world for commercial drone operations. In order for the drones to operate successfully commercially, something has to be done to allow them to properly and safely operate in commercial airspace. So this just involves a lot of regulatory work, technical work, involvement with the government. Even though we're recreational modelers, we're going to get caught up in this sooner or later. The most recent outgrowth of this was the remote ID regulations that came in March of 2024. I think we could reasonably expect more interest from the government, regulation, involvement, so it's best to stay informed in these matters. Also, when the FAA first started getting involved with unmanned aircraft, they just called them small unmanned aircraft systems, and anything that was not manned was lumped together. This included fixed-wing RC models like what I fly, as well as the quadcopters and drones that were just unmanned aircraft. However, as the discussion evolves, courts are more involved with use rules and so forth, it's becoming more and more evident, in my opinion, that there is a differentiation between the fixed-wing RC aircraft, the models typically fly at a local club field, and the drones, which are just more prevalent flying out everywhere. The reason for this basically is when we fly fixed-wing aircraft, we just enjoy seeing them fly, and so we tend to gravitate towards airfields. We need some amount of space to take off and land and operate our models. Also, another key thing with fixed-wing aircraft, 99% of fixed-wing models were not taking pictures. We're just out there flying, watching the airplanes fly. Drones, on the other hand, they're very affordable. They take minimal training, and due to the nature of the quadcopters and drones, they can fly literally anywhere. You can buy it in a store, go out to that store parking lot, and literally have the drone take off from the parking lot. And the other thing is, the drones tend to be a little bit more adventurous because they're looking for places to take pictures. And so not only do you have the issue of flight interacting with the public in non-club airfield environments, parking lots, and so forth, they're also taking pictures as privacy concerns. These are just some of the realities that we have to acknowledge as we deal with this situation as we go forward. So because we all like to fly our models, whether they're fixed wings or drones, we're using the airspace, so we're going to be involved with the FAA. We're using the ground to take off and land, so we're going to be involved with the public in some amount. It's always useful to learn from others. Maybe there's something we can learn from others that have been in this situation that can guide us towards future progress with these issues. And a good example of this is the ultralight community. So ultralights are small single-passenger aircraft. I'll get into the specifics here in a moment. They really didn't exist up until about the mid-1970s. What had happened was folks were doing hang gliding, and they were just hang gliders. They would go to an area, glide, use updrafts, fly. As the technology to build the hang gliders got more and more advanced, the hang gliders got to be pretty well performing gliders. And then in about the 1960s or so, people started putting engines on these hang gliders. Now all of a sudden you have not just a glider, but a powered aircraft carrying people. So the question is, where does this fall under FAA rules and regulations? Are these general aviation aircraft? Do they need pilot licenses? Do they need medicals? Just a lot of questions came up. So what had happened was in the early 1980s, the FAA determined they were going to have to write a regulation to cover what they call these ultralight aircraft. And what had happened at the time, various groups of hang gliders and the newly formed hobby of ultralight flying got together and worked with the FAA to come up with a regulation that would cover all these activities. Now, we know that today is Part 103 of the FAA regulations. There are different parts that do different things. Part 91, for example, is general aviation. Part 135 is air taxi. Part 121 is commercial air operations. Think United Airlines, Delta Airlines. So in any event, the FAA was writing Part 103. And what they did was, in the negotiations essentially between the ultralight flyers and the FAA, they agreed to give the ultralight community a surprising amount of freedom to pursue their flights, but they had to follow this regulation with a clear threat that if they didn't follow the regulations, there would be further regulations to control that from the FAA. So what came out of that to define an ultralight, to make sure that it was kind of defined and couldn't get to be too big, it had to be under 254 pounds. It could not fly faster than 55 miles an hour, could not carry passengers, and it could not carry more than 5 gallons worth of gas. Just to make sure these were slow, low-performance aircraft for the recreational enjoyment of the single pilots. The approach that the FAA took was they agreed to let the ultralight people fly their aircraft, and these aircraft, I'm not saying they're dangerous, but they're certainly not certified by the FAA. As part of the 103 rules, you do not need a pilot's license, you do not need a medical, you do not need any flight training even to fly these ultralight aircraft. You're just completely on your own. There are restrictions where they can fly. They can't fly at night. They can't fly over people. The general approach being, if you wish to take the risk of flying these, that's on you. Just don't harm anybody in the process. And so it's kind of interesting when you look up Part 103, this is just the opening part of it, but what the FAA says in the Part 103, and again, this was adopted on July 30th, 1982, over 40 years ago, because the FAA has given the ultralight community so much freedom to do their flying. This is what the FAA says in the summary. Quote, the FAA has chosen not to promulgate federal regulations regarding pilot certification, vehicle registration, preferring that the ultralight community assume the initiative for the development of these important safety programs. The ultralight community is expected to take positive action to develop these programs in a timely manner and gain FAA approval for their implementation. Should this approach fail to meet FAA safety objectives, further regulatory action may be necessary. So that's an interesting approach, and it has held up to now. The ultralight community has done what is needed in their conversations with the FAA to be allowed to operate under Part 103. I think there was a learning point from what the ultralight community did by organizing, engaging with the FAA. This is a similar thing that we're going to be doing with the FAA. The Academy of Model Aeronautics, in my opinion, did that successfully with remote ID. The initial remote ID ruling was not good for recreational flyers with requirements for national database and so forth. All that went away. There still is a remote ID ruling, but it's much better to the recreational flyer than without the involvement. As we go forward with more flying with the drones and RC model aircraft, this engagement will be to our benefit. But there's an interesting development with the ultralight regulations. These are the paramotor flyers. So just like the ultralights took hang gliders, put on a motor, with the paramotors, they took essentially a flying wing parachute, essentially a flying wing that is a glider, but it's a winged glider. And people didn't put engines on the glider because it's just cloth. Rather, they put the engines on their back, and suspended under this flying wing, they became powered parachutes, basically, these paragliders, and they fly. And they fall under the Part 103 regulations. There's no license, medical, or training required, although it's highly recommended. But unlike the fixed-wing ultralights that tend to operate out of airports or other airplanes that need runways to take off and land, the paragliders, paramotor operators can fly basically anywhere. They need a very small amount of land, certainly less than the size of a football field, to take off and land from their operations. And so now, when they're having meets or they're going to have some event, these paragliders can be flying from places that I don't normally see flight operations. There's a very good YouTuber named Tucker Gott. I'll put a link on him in the description. He does a very good job with his YouTube channel talking about safety, issues of paramotor operations. And here is the example he recently put on his channel where he was flying out of Florida. It was a small meet to fly around a cruise ship, and a police came in to basically threaten arrest to these paragliders.
Go somewhere else. If you take off, I can take you to jail. It's a police order. I'm not playing games. I'm not security.
Now, I did a little bit more research on this to include some former police officers. The cop, they can't just arrest you for what they're doing there. In this case, the cop was just out of line for that. It's going to be posted that there's no flying. It has to be somewhere in the county regulations or local regulations for that. And at worst, what they're going to do is just ask you to leave the property. But this is an indication of how the intersection of flying, local law enforcement, land use is still being formed. And we just have to understand that this is a work in progress, how we deal with it and how the FAA deals with this, because it is applicable to our model airplane operations. So what are the rules between the FAA, airspace, land use, local governments, and so forth? I think I can make it fairly simple and straightforward. First of all, the FAA controls all airspace. That's all airspace for flight operations. The FAA controls military operations, civilian operations, whether it's airliners, private pilots, the ultralights we just discussed. The FAA even controls rocket launches. Before SpaceX can launch a rocket, they need FAA approval and clearance for that flight, for the restricted airspace, the safety of the rocket, and so forth. So the FAA is in charge of permissions to fly in the airspace. However, the FAA does not have any authority to control the use of the land for the takeoff and landing. Use of the land for flight operations, whether they're for drones, RC models, or aircraft, are the responsibility of state, local governments, territory governments. They have a lot of say over what can and can't take off from their land regarding operations. So, for example, in the federal government, you cannot fly a drone in national parks. It's just prohibited from national parks. Technically, you could take off from outside the park, fly into the airspace, depending on the park. But what will happen is, if there is drones not allowed to fly there and the restriction is from the government, you'll see the no drone zone being posted that specifies that you cannot fly a drone in that area. Again, the no drone zone is only for government restricted flights. It cannot be used on private property, but that is a hint that you are not supposed to fly in that particular area. And again, the interaction with the public with aviation really wasn't the focus it is now in the past, because there were simply less people in the country and far less flight operations than there are today. So as an example, in 1935, there were 127 million people in the United States of America. Today, we have about 340 million. So back in the mid-1930s, the population of this country was about 35% of what it is today, just far less people. In addition, there were just less flight operations. To fly back in the mid-1930s, you need money. You had to buy an airplane. It was a big deal. There were essentially no models flying other than free flight. Radar control hadn't even been invented yet. And so there's just less interaction, less numbers of flight, less room for people to complain. That's not the case now with a population of 340 million people. Airports are always concerned, the use of the land, noise, Even today, the thought of building a new major airport is extremely hard to do just because of the need for the amount of land, noise concerns, and so forth. And again, we can take these lessons learned with the increase of the population and the fact that our new models, small size and drones, we can fly almost anywhere. It's just an indication there's going to be further interaction with the public on these matters, potentially further interaction with law enforcement. We just have to stay informed and engage with the FAA as this develops into further regulations. So another aspect that has been covered a lot, but I just want to touch upon it real quick here on where you can fly, is knowledge of the airspace. The basic rule of thumb when we fly our RC models or drones, we just have to stay out of controlled airspace unless we have the permission of the FAA to fly in that controlled airspace. As a recreational pilot, I don't think there's ever going to be a reason we're going to have to fly in controlled airspace. The Part 107 commercial pilots, they know far more about the rules, what they have to do to fly in controlled airspace. What we want to do as recreational flyers is make sure that we don't accidentally fly in controlled airspace. There are two things you can do to help on that. The FAA's Before You Fly app is a partnership with commercial companies. It's free of charge that will take your smartphone with the app. There's 4 companies that work for Before You Fly that provide their services. The best thing to do is just Google Before You Fly. You'll find out the companies and those app locations. They tend to change a little bit over time. But basically, a smartphone knows where you are. It can take this information and just very quickly determine if you're legal to fly there and the limits in terms of altitudes of where you can fly. Remember, for things like state parks, they say no flying's allowed. There may be some situation, an event, or something that you'd really like to fly your drone to take pictures of, or for whatever reason for your RC models. Exceptions are routinely granted. The idea is just talk to somebody in authority. The website had people to call for this. You can talk to a ranger, just explain what you're doing. You'd like an exception for this. Very often these can be granted. They just want to have some idea what's going on from a safety and public privacy point of view, what's going on in flight operations in their respective areas. This is an example of drone laws in Georgia from the UAV Coach. A bunch of websites, if you Google it. It's a good rundown of the federal drone laws in Georgia, what to do as a commercial pilot, how to fly as a hobbyist or recreational pilot, and as a government employee. They discuss the state laws in Georgia, how state law preempts local governments for these sorts of things. They discuss Georgia Department of Natural Resources. They even have a name and an email address that you can contact. And then just some specifics of various cities. You get a feel for how they would like to go about seeing drone operations work in the state. Just because we're discussing it, the question has come up, can I build an airport on my private property? Let's say I have a couple of acres of land. Can I build an airport to fly airplanes on my property? And the answer is yes. The FAA really doesn't care that you build an airport. The only thing the FAA cares about is make sure if you build that airport that it's not located where the moment you take off you'll be in controlled airspace. It has to be Class G uncontrolled airspace. But other than that, the FAA doesn't really care. It's a pretty amazing number, but in the United States of America in 2024, there are about 19,400 airports. That is a lot of airports as far as I'm concerned. Now, 5,000 of those airports are public use airports. Anybody can go in and use them with permission, control towers and so forth. However, 14,400 airports are private airports. Somebody just built an airport, it's on their private land, you can't go in there unless you have permission. And so there's a lot of people that build their own airports. The one thing you do have to do if you decide to build an airport, do check with local authorities. There might be some land use restrictions on airports, noises, whatever. The FAA doesn't really care. If you get permission from the local authorities to build an airport, you're good to go with that airport. And you can even register with the FAA if you wish. Just contact your local FAA office, and they'll have the paperwork needed to get that on their airfield and flight facility directory, just for the record. So thank you for joining me in this video. As we progress with our drone and RC airplane flying, we're going to be more and more interactive with the public during our flight operations. We can learn from the ultralight and paramotor community, from their lessons learned with law enforcement, the do's and don'ts. The internet is a very valuable source of information on where you can land and take off with model aircraft, as well as the Before You Fly app, which is solely concerned about airspace, where you might take off and land. So thank you for joining me in this video, and we look forward to seeing you in future videos.